6 on Monday, May 22nd, and I surely want to thank everyone for their time for joining this listening session with us today. I'm Esche Jackson. I am chair of the commission. Before I share more, I'd like to give fellow commissioners an opportunity to introduce themselves if they'd like to.
I actually don't think we have any of them online.
Oh, no?
Nope.
Okay, well, if they want to introduce themselves at a later point, they'll be welcome to do that. We'll have a Q&A segment at the end, and that could be an appropriate time to do that. But for now, let me just sort of introduce the presentation. And so the purpose of today's meeting is that we want to have open dialogue about the resources and services that are available to survivors of sexual misconduct. We've collaborated with the DA's office, specifically the Bureau of Victim Services, to help us share the most current information as a resource to the public. And we want to first hear the presentation from Ms. Tanishia Wright. Thank you for being here, Tanishia. She is the Director of the Director of the Bureau of Victim Services within the DA's office, and we will follow her presentation with a Q&A guided by fellow commissioners or POC Sexual Misconduct Ad Hoc Committee members, which includes myself, and we'll conclude the presentation or today's meeting with comments and questions from the commissioners. Wende, let's have you take over and introduce yourself and explain how those watching can participate today. Thank you. I think you're muted.
That would help if I'm. Can you tell we've been having meetings in person? I'm out of practice with WebEx. So thank you for joining. As I mentioned at the beginning, our main purpose for this is to provide an educational opportunity for people to be able to access as we continue the discussions of the Sexual Misconduct Ad Hoc Committee. And we look forward to participation from anyone who'd like to today. But also, if you have questions that come up, if you watch this video in the future, please feel free to reach out to us. You can submit comments or questions to info@poc.lacounty.gov. And I'm sure that Ms. Wright will also provide information where you can get more information from the DA's office specifically. We are broadcasting live to Facebook, and we will put the video up on YouTube as soon as we have the recording back. You're welcome to follow us on social media at LA County POC for more information about our meetings. This is not a Brown Act meeting. We are not taking any action, and we don't have a quorum of commissioners here, but we will be welcoming your public comment if you wish to give it. So you can send that public comment in writing at info@poc.lacounty.gov. And you can also use the little raise your hand function, and we'll explain that later on how to do it. So I think that it's just important to note that the Commission does not have any formal authority over the issue of sexual misconduct. We are a body that makes recommendations through the actions of the 9 commissioners to the Board of Supervisors and acts as a liaison between the Board of Supervisors and the county. But this is the purpose of this is as a listening session. So, le doy la bienvenida a personas que están visitándonos que prefieren hacer sus preguntas o sus comentarios en español. Usted puede también usar la función de levantar la mano y yo le puedo traducir si quiere, o puede proveer su propia traducción, o nos puede mandar un email en español. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Chair Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Wende. I think it's a good time to introduce Tanishia, who we'd like to share a little bit about herself and then proceed with her presentation. Thank you, Tanishia. You can get started.
Awesome, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Tanishia Wright. I am the Director of the Bureau of Victim Services here with the LA District Attorney's Office. And I'm just really excited to be here to have this discussion with you and to really give you an overview of all of the services that the Bureau offers. I think it's really important to, of course, address the issue of sexual misconduct, but really talk about all of our services as a whole, because I'm not sure, for those of you that are listening, if you're aware of everything that we do. So I want to kind of start with this more of a general, very broad overview, and then we can definitely talk about the specifics when we get to the Q&A portion. All right, and let me just make sure this The slide is not skipping ahead, is it? I know the one that there's
Now
a
it's on an introductory slide that says helping victims become survivors.
perfect. I had one version that was kind of doing its own thing by kind of skipping. It was skipping ahead. So I hope this is not the version. All right. Yeah, so our mission statement is we truly are dedicated to helping victims become survivors. This is our district attorney that I'm sure all of you are very much aware of, District Attorney George Gascon. Next slide, please. All right, so as this is coming up, so hopefully we can pause this here for a second. So our Bureau, just for background, for those of you that are not aware, our Bureau is split into 3 divisions. This is how we are best able to assist victims. So we have a direct services, a claims verification unit, and a restitution enhancement program. So all 3 of these divisions make up the Bureau of Victim Services. So for our direct services, these are our victim service representatives, or advocates is what we call them. They provide assistance to crime victims in courthouses and law enforcement stations throughout Los Angeles County. So what does that look like in the real world? These are advocates that are working directly with victims. They are very hands-on. They're working with them from the very beginning, from the very initial stages when a crime occurs, and they work with them and follow them all throughout that journey. And obviously that looks very different for each victim because of course there's many different levels of crime. So they're very hands-on. Our claims verification unit, not as hands-on, but they are still definitely working with victims. They're processing claims behind the scenes. And then our restitution enhancement program, they're also working with victims, but again, not as direct as our direct services advocates, but they're working and advocating on behalf of the victims to get restitution if it's applicable. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick snapshot. I know this looks like a lot aesthetically, but just for those of you that are not aware, so we have approximately 70 victim service advocates that pretty much service all of Los Angeles County, right? Which is definitely nowhere near enough because of the high levels of crime throughout our county and just throughout our entire country at this moment. But we're pretty much stationed everywhere, from Los Angeles County, Long Beach to beach cities, the Valley, downtown LA, all the way through Palmdale, Lancaster, Pasadena, etc. Next slide, please. And this is just another quick snapshot. These are phone numbers. Of course, you don't have to write all this down. If anyone wants access to this, you can definitely reach out to me. My contact information is at the end, and I can get you these very specific numbers to our special advocacy program specifically. So you'll see our branch area offices. We have advocates located. We have LA County Sheriff Departments, like I mentioned, police stations. And then here, of course, our special advocacy programs. We have an elder abuse division. We have a family violence division, financial fraud and cyber crimes. We have a hate and target crimes division, human trafficking division, juvenile advocacy services, a lifer and post-convictions unit. We have a realignment victim services unit. We do have a sex crimes division, obviously, which is where a lot of the sexual misconduct cases would go to and would be handled. Community violence reduction, victims' rights assistance, and our victim services canine unit, which are our lovely facility dogs. Next slide, please. So how do we assist crime victims and their families? Next slide. We work with victims to, we start off with crisis intervention. So the very first thing that happens when a victim of a crime is going through their process, all of our advocates actually have been trained in trauma and trauma-informed care for years. This is something that is not new to them. They're all very well equipped to do crisis intervention. They're not necessarily licensed clinicians. I get that question all the time. A lot of them are not licensed clinicians, but they are very well equipped and very trained in providing immediate crisis interventions to victims. We do a lot of emergency assistance, resources and referral counselings, victim compensation assistance, and we're going to get way more into this shortly. If it's safe, we will work with the victims to get return of their property. Very early on, there's an orientation to the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, a lot of our victims of crime have no idea what the criminal justice system is, how it works, court escort and support. We do case status, disposition, information, and of course, like I mentioned earlier, restitution assistance. Next slide. So crisis intervention. This can be a personal or telephone response to the immediate emotional and physical needs of the victim. We provide victims with immediate referrals to the appropriate local service agencies, specifically to, let's say, mental health and counseling services. We always try our best to get victims immediately connected to mental and behavioral health resources. And that's going to look different, of course, depending on the victim and their family members. Next slide. Some examples of emergency assistance that we will provide are temporary shelter, food, transportation, vouchers, clothing, medical care, prescription medicine if applicable, eyeglasses, dentures, and these are all things that more so we are helping to get reimbursed, get the victims reimbursed for. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, resources and referral counseling, referrals to the appropriate individual or agency for services not provided directly by our program. We do not provide behavioral health clinical services. Again, all of our advocates and all of our staff are continuously being trained in trauma-informed care, as they have over the past 30 plus years that Victim Services has been around. But we are more so of the liaison to make sure that victims and their families are connected to mental health providers that can really take care of them. Next slide. We work very closely with victims and their families with filling out applications for the California Victims Compensation Board. And this would help to potentially cover some of the financial losses, such as medical expenses, mental health counseling, loss of income, loss of support in general, funeral and burial costs, there's also some limits to that, crime scene cleanup if applicable, and job rehabilitation. And we'll talk more about that too under the State Restitution Fund. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we do very early on for all victims is we try our best to do an orientation to the criminal justice system. So that means we're providing victims and witnesses with verbal information on the location, procedures, and functioning of the criminal justice system. We're continuously informing victims and witnesses what they should expect in terms of testifying. And that could be direct and cross-examination and possible court delays, which happens all the time. Next slide. This is pretty much, this is something that our victim service representatives or advocates, they do this every single day. This makes up a large portion of the work that they do. The direct service advocates, to be specifically, there's a lot of court escort and support. So with victims of sexual misconduct and victims across the board, our advocates are directly in court with them, providing a host of different court support services, whether it's just to be there as a support. Sometimes we're reading victim impact statements. Sometimes our VSK canine, our facility dogs are also there supporting these victims, especially the young victims. So we're providing information or court support to the victim or witnesses during court appearances. And I can honestly tell you that the victims and their families, just over the year that I've been in this role, are continuously expressing their appreciation and support, because sometimes victims and witnesses, they don't have family members or support to actually willing to come out to help them and assist them and be with them. And our advocates have shown time and time again and have proven to always rise to the occasion and be that support to the victims and or their families. We're constantly updating on case status disposition information. So it's extremely important to keep victims and witnesses apprised of significant developments and the disposition of the case in which they are involved. We assist victims with the preparation of a written victim impact statement, as I mentioned previously. Court and parole board and/or present the impact statement at the time of sentencing and/or parole hearing. Next slide, please. If safe and if applicable, we will assist with the return of property and restitution. So that means assisting the victims with contacting law enforcement agencies when property is no longer needed in the prosecution. We also assist victims in determining what restitution is owed to them. Next slide, please. We also have a restitution enhancement program, as I mentioned earlier. Let's try to pause this here. So our restitution enhancement program assistance is that we assist with obtaining restitution for the victim, as I mentioned, ascertaining to the victim's economic loss. We provide the probation department, the district attorney, and court with information relevant to the victim's losses prior to the imposition of the sentence. At least we try to do that. Next slide, please. Our CDCR form 1707. So victims can request special conditions of parole. So this is basically, this form is very crucial and something that we do very early on. This is where a victim can request to be notified of an inmate's release, escape, death, or parole hearing. So we do this for every single one of the victims that we work with. We also, again, okay, go back 1 second. Sorry. I think the slide is advancing on its own. Our restitution order, again, money will be withheld from the inmate's wages or money put on the books. And our advocates, our victim service representatives will help the victims fill out these forms to make sure that they are kept aware of everything that's happening regarding that inmate. Next slide, please. And these are just optional victim services that we may or may not be able to assist with. As far as creditor and employer intervention, again, restitution, notification of court calendar changes, funeral arrangement and assistance. Unfortunately, we do a lot of funeral and burial processing every single week, unfortunately. Restraining orders, witness protection assistance, and relocation. Next slide, please. So legal authority for victims' rights. Under the California Constitution, victims have a right to know. And that's what we all, of course, will refer to as Marcy's Law. Almost nothing, so most California cases, law on victims' rights are on restitution issues. And these are just statutory penal codes that some of you may or may not be familiar with. Next slide, please. So victims' rights now included in the California Constitution. Many rights were previously in statutes. Some rights were automatic, others must be requested. So included in this presentation are those rights relating specifically to law enforcement. So most of Marcy's laws deals with the rights that come into play once a criminal case is filed. That's very important to keep in mind. Next slide. The right of the victims have a right to be treated with fairness and respect for his or her privacy and dignity, and to be free from intimidation, harassment, and abuse throughout the criminal or juvenile justice process. These rights are to be honored and protected by law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges in a manner no less vigorous than the protections afforded criminal defendants. Next slide, please. There is a right to safety, to be reasonably protected from the defendant and persons acting on behalf of the defendant, to have the safety of the victim and the victim's family considered in fixing the amount of bail or release conditions for the defendant. And also the right to prevent the disclosure of confidential information or records to the defendant, which is extremely important. Next slide, please. Victims have a right to know what's going on. Victims can refuse an interview or discovery requests by the defense and to set reasonable conditions on the conduct of any interview to which the victim consents. To be reasonable notice and to reasonably confer with the prosecutor regarding the arrest, charges, extradition, and plea bargain. There's no right to reasonably confer with law enforcement. To reasonable notice of all public proceedings in court and parole. Next slide, please. And victims have a right to be informed of all Marsy's Law rights, a right to be provided information regarding civil recovery and opportunity to be compensated from the California Victims Compensation Board, and law enforcement must provide victims with information on Marsy's Law and Cal VCB. And you will receive handouts about Marsy's Law and more information regarding Cal VCB. So that was all emailed. So everyone attending this webinar will also receive very specific BVS handouts that takes more of a deeper dive into some of these things that you'll hear me talk about today. Next slide. And then the right to restitution and property be returned. And so what does that look like? Again, medical bills, lost wages, relocation, retrofit vehicle, home security installation or upgrade. We receive a lot of requests for home security installations and or upgrades, as you can imagine. Job retraining, job support for 187 victims' children, lost, stolen, damaged property, funeral and burial, and non-economic loss for 288 victims for pain and suffering. Next slide, please. And so these are just some of the victim statutory rights. Notification of cancellations of court proceeding, pretrial disposition, all sentencing proceedings appear and give statement, expeditious disposition, criminal action, return of property again, civil recovery, restitution, and witness fees. Next slide. Victims have a right to a support person. So victims of sexual assault and domestic violence are entitled to have a support person with them during a law enforcement interview. However, support person can be excluded if it would jeopardize the purpose of the interview. The initial interview to determine whether a crime has been committed or the identity of the suspect is not included. So the victims of violent crimes are entitled to a support person when they testify in court. Next slide, please. So this is contempt of court. So any witness can be held in contempt for refusing to obey a subpoena and come to court. And the court cannot put a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence in jail for refusing to testify. And this is just for educational purposes. Next slide, please. Our child victims and special procedures. Our children can get extra breaks during testimony, of course. The judge may remove the robe to help the child feel less intimidated, rearrange the courtroom to make a more comfortable and personal environment, and testimony could be limited to just school hours. Next slide. The judge can remove intimidating witnesses, of course, because again, we're dealing with young victims. And unfortunately, there are a lot of young victims that are also victims of sexual misconduct, etc. The judge can close the courtroom or allow closed circuit TV in very limited situations. And the judge can modify oath to tell the truth. Next slide, please. So there are what we call child interview services, and I won't necessarily read through all of this. But basically, a multidisciplinary team response to child abuse allegations include representation from law enforcement, child protective services, prosecution, medical, mental health, and victim advocacy. And so the purpose of this interagency collaboration is to coordinate intervention and share information and reduce the potential trauma to children by reducing the number of interviews that children must give. So can you imagine the cases where we have children involved? It's just so much easier where we have these child interview centers where everyone is kind of there as a team to create more of this wraparound environment for the kid. These centers do not charge for conducting interviews. Next slide, please. This is just an idea to give you a snapshot of where they're located. Van Nuys, Los Angeles, Santa Monica, Torrance, Covina. Next slide, please. So what are some of the additional victim losses? I know I've covered some of this already. Next slide. So payment for victim losses comes from two sources. As I mentioned earlier, our state restitution fund, our California Victims Compensation Board, or our restitution order from a convicted defendant. Next slide, please. So Cal VCB. So victims eligible for compensation usually have to be a direct victim or a derivative victim's family, household member, certain recipient witnesses to a crime, or a primary caretaker of a victim. Next slide, please. The victim must be a California resident at the time of the crime, or the crime must have occurred in California. We oftentimes will get victims where a crime has occurred in a different state, reaching out to BVS. And it could be, and there's been multiple crimes of sexual misconduct that did not happen in California. And we've had to refer those victims out to the respective victim services within the actual location where the crime took place. Victims must cooperate with law enforcement and prosecutors. Victims cannot have been involved in the events leading up to the qualifying crime. And victims must apply within 7 years of the date of the crime, or 7 years after the victim attains 21 years of age, which is also something very important and crucial to know, because we also will get, and not that we would turn anyone away, but even recently I had someone reach out to me that was a victim of a sex crime, and it happened in the 60s. And so we still did our best to accommodate that individual, but when it comes to Cal VCB, there are certain levels, there are certain statutes in place when dealing with Cal VCB. Next slide. Continue. So Cal VCB cannot reimburse expenses while the victim or derivative victim is on a restricted status. For example, on parole, probation, or post-release community supervision for a violent felony while they're incarcerated, they are required, or if they're required to register as a sex offender. Cal VCB may consider and pay crime-related expenses if they are incurred before or after the restricted status. So if the claim is otherwise eligible, the claim may be allowed, but expenses incurred during this period will not be paid. Next slide, please. So some of the criteria: the crime must have caused a physical or a threat of injury. The property loss is not covered. Restitution fund is a payer of last resort. Cal VCB is always a payer of last resort. So usually victims, for the most part, have to usually go through their own medical insurance, which sometimes creates a huge barrier to receiving compensation. For certain crimes, emotional injury alone can be sufficient, which is also good to know. Certain family members or other loved ones who suffer economic loss resulting from an injury or death of a victim of a crime may also be eligible. Next slide, please. So the categories that are generally eligible for compensation, as I mentioned, the person who is physically injured or threatened with physical injury as a result, the eligible family member or other specified person who were legally dependent on the victim, a parent, a sibling, spouse, or child of the victim, family member of the victim who witnessed the crime. Next slide, please. Minors who witness a crime of domestic violence or who reside in the home where the domestic violence occurs. Next bullet. I think there's a few more. Minors who suffer emotional injury, of course, and anyone who pays or assumes legal liability for a deceased victim's medical, funeral, or burial expenses, or anyone who pays for a crime scene cleanup. Examples of crimes typically covered that I haven't covered already. So assault with a deadly weapon, battery with an injury, child abuse, domestic violence, driving under the influence with injury, hit and run with injury, vehicular manslaughter, murder, robbery, sexual assault, of course, stalking, kidnapping, unlawful sexual intercourse, criminal threats, and human trafficking. And these are some of the crime-related expenses that CalVCB may help pay for again. I know we talked about this a little earlier, but it's always good to know again. Medical, mental health, income, funeral and burial, relocation, residential security, crime scene cleanup, and medical equipment. Next slide, please. Now, we always want to include, in addition to what the advocates do, as that was a more of an educational, deeper dive into what that looks like behind the scenes as far as compensation, what's covered, what's not covered. Our BVS, our Bureau of Victim Services K-9 unit, for now, it consists of 3 facility dogs, Skippy to the left, Lennox and Nora to the right. These dogs are advocates in their own right. They have worked with hundreds of victims and their families and provided comfort and court support in a host of different situations. And not just through court. Our dogs have also responded to some of the mass violence incidents that's happened, not just here in California, but also in other states as well. In fact, all 3 of them were present, if I'm not mistaken, or at least 2 of them were present at the recent Family Assistance Center where we responded to the Monterey Park mass shooting. But I will say, if you have not had an opportunity to interact with our facility dogs, I highly encourage you to do so. They provide so much warmth and so much comfort, especially to our young victims, our victims of sexual misconduct. Just having them present there really, really makes all the difference. Next slide. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what they do. So they help child victims and other vulnerable victims of crime during interviews, preparation for testimony, and testimony at prelim hearings and trials. They really do lessen the stress and trauma of the courthouse environment. I can't express that enough. They're very calming to the victims and they have very positive interactions. And as all dogs, they provide a lot of support without bias. They comfort the family during testimony if outside the courtroom. And this was just a quote by one of our young victims stating that the day that he had met Skippy, I think he confused Skippy with Nora, but he was able to say what happened to me because he had Nora by his side. Next slide. This was a picture that was taken last year, actually, during National Victims' Rights Week. We do have an updated version, but this is half of the staff. The Bureau of Victim Services, we have approximately 117 staff across the board. Like I mentioned, about 66 of those staff members approximately are victim service advocates. The rest make up our restitution paralegal team, our management team, and our assistant program administrators, our APAs, and our program manager. Next slide, please. And this is something that I just always mention in general. Some of you may or may not be aware of this, but every single year we do a holiday giving drive where we're giving back to the community, we're giving back to the victims. COVID has changed a lot of that over the past few years because we've done a lot of electronic gifting of gift cards. But next slide, I think there's a picture here. If you can advance to the next slide, but prior to COVID, maybe not, it was taken out. Okay, you can go back. So prior to COVID, you know, and this has been going on for years, there has been lots of gifts and donations that have been made to victims and their families throughout the holiday season. And it can be anywhere from clothes, bikes, toys, a host of different things. So this is something that's just really important that we want to highlight. And now we can advance to the next slide. And this is our contact information. Again, everyone attending the webinar, there are very specific pamphlets that's attached to all of this where you can take more of a deeper dive and get very specific contact numbers and resources and learn more about CalVCB and Marcy's Law and orientation to the criminal court system and how victims and victims' rights. So those are all things that you will all receive shortly. Our toll-free number is here, which is 800-380-3811. And that's a number where you can call to be directly connected to someone from our team and to just get very direct victim service resources, or speak to one of our admin team that can help field calls and direct you to the appropriate person to talk to. And then I would also highly recommend, if you have not done so or are aware of this, victim services. We do have a website that is housed within the DA's larger website. And that's the handle at the very bottom, da.lacounty.gov/victims. All of our services are there. All of our pamphlets are there in PDF format. Most of them are in English and Spanish. We do also have another select handful of pamphlets that are in different languages. So I would also encourage you to visit our website and read more about our services. And that way you'll be able to, if you're working with any of the populations that I mentioned earlier, you're able to kind of quickly connect them to our services and resources as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Tanishia, right? I realized that I mispronounced that earlier, so I apologize for that, but that was a very informative presentation, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to offer that to us this afternoon. It looks like another commissioner has joined us, and I'd like to give her a chance to introduce herself, and then I'd like to follow up with a question, and hopefully she has questions for you as well. Diane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi all, I apologize, I'm in transit, but thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm Diane Terry, new to the commission, and I just appreciate the presentation and it's helpful to know what's available. So no questions at this time.
Okay, thank you for that, Diane. So Tanisha, I mean, you talked about a lot of different services that your office or the department provides, and out of those services, what kind of feedback have you gotten about how effective they are?
About how effective our services are as a whole?
Or you can talk about maybe areas that you're very strong in, and maybe some areas that could use some improvement.
Yeah, I would say there's always areas of improvement. I would say I've been in this role for about a year, and maybe I'm biased, but I feel like all of our advocates in the work that we do, we're strong in every area, but of course we know that's not true. I would say that the advocates are really strong and ensuring that they are responding to victims and their needs immediately. I would also say that I'm trying to think as far as feedback that we've received as far as our services in ways that we can improve. One thing that I will say, a lot of people are just not aware that we exist still to this day, not to mention what we do. That's why I feel like it was so important to kind of take a step back and take a really deeper dive into what victim services done, because what victim services does, because to be honest, we've been around for 30 plus years. We've been a part of the DA's office and under the DA umbrella for a really long time. And a lot of people are still not sure about the fact that they can come to us after a crime occurs, and we can offer them these services. One of the things that I will say that why we've kind of been elevated is because of our district attorney. The district attorney has been really good with putting victim services out there at the forefront of a lot of the work that the DA's office is doing. So because of his positive dialogue about us, we've received a lot more of attention, which is great, in my opinion.
That is great. Or do you guys have any strategies to sort of improve outreach outside of what the DA has in place already?
Yeah, so what we've been doing is really amping up our presence in the community. Our advocates, so now under our DA, we're just out more in the community. We're doing more tabling at events, we're speaking at more events. We're collaborating more with other agencies and partnering with them on their events. we don't necessarily have like a robust social media campaign, but our LADA social media, our LADA social media has been really great at putting victim services at the forefront of a lot of the work and just highlighting the fact that we do exist on the LADA social media platforms. And that's been really, really helpful. One of the things that I will say from a feedback standpoint that we did receive from the community, and even our Crime Victims Advisory Board, which is the board that I work very closely with to kind of lead the efforts with victim services alongside with my BVS management team, is our website. Of course, our website could always be updated and just much more efficient and effective when it comes to people coming to the website and really learning how to navigate that. So that's something that we're continuously trying to work on. And as far as updating our pamphlets, make sure our pamphlets are clear and they just make sense for people. And so we're kind of there, but we're still definitely working on that. And our website is an ongoing thing. The DA's website as a whole, I think, is great. But when it comes to victim services, we definitely could, we can definitely use more assistance with that, and something that we're working on.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely really important, I think, and after we had this conversation, the POC could certainly help highlight the services that you provide. It feels especially important to me, especially with this misconduct sort of crisis in front of us, that victims feel like they have a place that they can go to sort of get the support that they need. I want to feel like if we're referring people to victim services that, you know, we can trust that they're provided effective services, right? And because there is a limit to what we can do, right? And so it's helpful to know that that's in place, and doesn't really help to have the services in place if they don't know they exist, right? So
that's why the outreach, the education, is all so very much important.
It's all very important.
Anytime we are asked to present or going, like even with the invitation to present here on behalf of the POC, we were like, yes, of course. We're always trying to make sure that we take a step back and have an opportunity to present and to let everyone know that we're here, and to just try to be as specific as possible to what we're doing.
What kind of victims do you hear from the most? There's a wide range of sort of areas that you cover. I'm just curious.
Yeah, honestly, it's a very wide range. But I will say, if I just would go off of recently, a lot of domestic violence, victims of domestic violence.
Okay.
But we definitely cover a very wide range. I mean, pretty much any and everything that happens across LA County.
When you have like a big like class action suit like this issue with the probation department, do you guys, and I'll leave it to someone else to ask questions because these are all my personal curiosities. Do you feel like, you know, that you're equipped to basically address all the needs of the victims that might potentially come to you for services?
If there was a class action lawsuit?
Like what's in front of us, pretty much.
You know, I would think that us at the DA's office as a whole, yes, as an entire entity, we would be able to address something like that. Yes.
Wende, do you have anything? I don't want to suck the life out of this segment, which
Thank you. I do have a couple of questions. I just want to echo what Chair Jackson said about how glad I am that you're here to present this information, because the sexual misconduct subcommittee actually asked for staff to go and look for options around the country of how agencies and entities that have had similar situations are providing services to survivors. And lo and behold, we have a really great option right in our backyard.
Of course.
So we really appreciate this and look forward to be able to post this webinar for folks to look at, for us to send out to people who reach out to us. And we'll also have a link to all of your handouts on our website and link to your website. A couple of questions. Well, and first I just want to say I worked at Children's Court, as many people know, for many years, and watched the canine units and how they helped young people and adults prepare for very difficult testimony and trial. So I will just echo how incredible I think that program is. So you mentioned this a little bit about qualifications for restitution and repayments, but what about qualifications for your other services for crimes that happened a long time ago, more than the 7 years ago?
And that's where it gets a little tricky. In all honesty, so if we can't go through CalVCB or our restitution fund, we do have something within victim services that we will tap into if applicable, which is called our unclaimed restitution fund. Obviously, there's a lot of restitution out there and some of it is unclaimed, if not a lot of it is unclaimed. So for things that we are not able to necessarily get funding, compensated for, we will tap into our unclaimed restitution fund. But
Great.
again, even that has limits to it.
Sure.
As well, because, that fund can also run out at some point.
I think what I'm asking, I also had a conversation recently with someone describing criminal activity. This one happened in the 90s, but some beyond the scope of the 7 years. But in terms of like some of the things you would suggest.
Wendy, your audio is not so good.
That's something. I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I turn off the video, does it work better?
That's
Okay.
a lot better, yeah.
Better.
So you're still, I guess my question is exactly what Esche asked. Should we still refer people to you, even if they were victims of crime 20 years ago?
I would say yes, because no matter what, we would do the best that we can, even if it's just as simple as getting them connected to mental health resources. If we're not able to, assist someone for whatever reason, that for a crime that happened back in the 70s or, 60s or whatever it occurred, I feel strong to say that our staff could probably connect them to someone or a resource that can.
Great, thank you. And what about crimes that have not been reported, or for a victim that wishes that's not interested in reporting the crime?
And that happens all the time. Yeah, it definitely happens all the time for multiple reasons. We would still assist them as much as we could. When it comes to CalVCB, it can be tricky because sometimes CalVCB require police reports, right? And if there's no police report, then it can make the situation a little tricky, but we will still 100% work with the victim no matter what.
Great, thank you.
As far as compensation is concerned, then that becomes a different story.
Those are all my questions, Esche.
Oh, great. Diane, do you have any questions? And if we don't have any real-time questions, Tanishia, I'm hoping that we're welcome to reach out after the fact, because that could be good for us.
Absolutely. And I also want to let you know, which I didn't add in this slide, we do, of course, we have our sex crimes division that handles these cases, and we have a victim service advocate that is specific, she's specialized and works in our sex crimes division. So I can also make sure that you have, I'm not sure if you even have her contact information, but I will make sure that you have her information as well. We had a town hall, if I'm not mistaken, about a week or two ago where we talked about this as well. And that's all, that should be available on our website, because we had our sex crimes advocate there along with the DDA in that division. So I want to make sure that you're also aware of that and you also have that recording too.
Okay, yeah, we'd like to be able to access that. I wasn't able to attend, and I actually haven't even had a chance to see it. So yeah, that could be good.
We'll make sure to
I
link
had
on the website as well. Sorry, go ahead, Diane.
just one question, and I might not have heard clearly since I was driving, but you were mentioning something about folks who have a certain status, and so if they're on probation or parole, there's something in particular that they're not entitled. Was it support through your office? Is that what you were saying? So you can't be currently on probation or parole in order to get the support, or am I misunderstanding?
Yes and no. So our office will, no matter what, try to work with victims and families that fall within that category. But with CalVCB, with the California Victims Compensation Board, there are limitations. So if they consider you as someone that, participated in activity leading up to the crime, and like you said, if they're incarcerated, if they're on probation, a perfect example, if a family member loses a loved one at the hands of a law enforcement, which happens unfortunately a lot across our country and in LA specifically. It's hard for us to, it's easy for us to work with CalVCB, but it's hard getting the reimbursement for funeral and burial because it's something that they usually will not reimburse if the person was not cooperative or just being involved with law enforcement and losing their life at the hands of law enforcement. So that's something that we are not at this moment been able to get compensation for. But there are some Senate bills right now that are working to hopefully change that, to change the statutes for everyone in that category across the board. There's some legislation out there right now that will hopefully change that.
Is that it?
Well, do you want, I'd like to invite anyone who's attending as a participant. If you have a question, if you'd like to use the raise your hand function, you're welcome to click on that little raise your hand function, or if you're calling in, you can dial *3 on your phone and it will raise your hand. Also, if you're watching this video after the fact, not live, we, as Chair Jackson said, we'd love to get your questions and we can help connect you with the DA's office about questions you have specifically about their victim services. So feel free to send us an email to info@poc.lacounty.gov. We'll also have all the reference materials attached along with the video. I don't see that anyone has raised their hand. I think partially that may be because that presentation was so comprehensive. It's really, I feel really great about what you were able to share with us today as something we can share with folks who reach out to us and some of the survivors we've already connected with and those we may connect with in the future so that we can just hand off something that's informative and warm. So we appreciate your approach and your willingness to do this today.
Of course, of course. Thank you for the invitation. It's always great to be in these spaces where we can, first of all, I love just meeting, even though it's virtually. I'm a people person, so I love meeting people and connecting. So it's just great to be here in the space to provide the information.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I definitely feel like you answered a lot of questions that I have. So we appreciate how thorough that presentation was. And members of the public, we certainly hope you feel compelled to ask any questions or make comments here. We appreciate you being here, but if not, you're welcome to do so after the fact. And if you don't, I will gladly close us out and look forward to us continuing our efforts in this area as it relates to our sexual violence cases. So, Wende, any hands last minute? I'm going to close us out.
No hands. I'll just say we have our regular Probation Oversight Commission meeting this Thursday, 12 p.m. at the Hall of Administration. The email and
Uh-oh, she froze again.
Wende, that didn't sound too good.
be going on soon. Already posted, but, we'd love for you to join us. I don't know what's going on with my connection over here. We have our regular meeting on Thursday, 12 p.m. At the Hall of Admin, or join us virtually.
Yes, hope to see you all there. I'm going to close us out. We certainly appreciate you all joining us and looking forward to continuing our work and hearing from you. Again, thanks for listening in and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.